Be here. My name is Najwan Al-Junaid. I'm the MLA for Calgary Glenmore. It's good to be here, and I'd like to invite my guest, the Alberta NDP leader, Naheed Nenshi, to join me here.
Well, thanks, everybody. I love the theater, and I would encourage all Albertans to go see a great Christmas show this season. That was the worst act of theater I have ever seen. Pure performance, completely meaningless, and really quite shocking on a day when Alberta and Canada are facing an existential crisis. What the incoming president's administration has announced would devastate the Alberta economy. Those are real numbers, not the fake unsourced numbers that you heard from the Premier earlier today. And instead of taking a Team Canada approach, the Premier does what one should never do in a negotiation, which is show the other party that you are divided. So the Premier claims to have been surprised by Trump's announcement of exactly what he's been promising to do for a year. She claims to have been taken aback and how it could not change her timing on the path that she already has. The Premier is surprised about a lot of things. She was surprised that the Alberta is Calling campaign actually brought people here. She was surprised that those people who came here didn't bring family doctors or schools in their suitcases. She is surprised that Alberta has the highest unemployment outside of Newfoundland. She is surprised that Alberta has the highest inflation rate in the country. She is surprised that people can't make ends meet. Today, she seems surprised that her own MLAs voted for a pay or an allowance increase for themselves, not for anyone else. So she's surprised a lot. But the point is, we can't afford to be surprised right now. And what we had was a bit of a performance. The Premier reading a bunch of numbers, someone who is ostensibly the Minister of the Environment, giving you 5 minutes of prepared remarks in which she did not mention the word environment and barely mentioned the word emissions. I'd like to quote from someone else who called last summer the Sovereignty Act. Oh, let's see if I've got the right words here. Oh, I've lost it. But I will tell you that he called it counterproductive and virtue signaling. That's our Minister of Energy, Brian Jean, who stood on stage today and said not one word about the use of this act. So what we have here is performance. Literally not one thing that the Premier announced today requires the Sovereignty Act to be done. As she herself put it, she could table this legislation in the spring when she figures out what she's doing. This is straight up virtue signaling to say that we're using the Sovereignty Act. The one and only thing the use of the Sovereignty Act could do is reverse the onus on a legal challenge. In other words, you're going to be in the same courtroom, having the same arguments, you just might be sitting on the other side of the courtroom. That's it. That's all they've done today. But what she is suggesting is on her menu of things is pretty shocking. So she is suggesting that she will muzzle oil companies and not allow them to tell their own shareholders how they're doing on environment. This is the same Premier who suggests that Bill C-59, the greenwashing bill, is muzzling. She's like, well, you don't muzzle enough, so let's muzzle them some more. The same way this government does not allow school boards to report on class sizes. They don't want Albertans to know. And for oil and gas companies, this is even worse, because oil and gas companies have responsibilities to their shareholders. Canadian subsidiaries of international firms have responsibility to their international firms to talk about how they're doing on emissions. And the Premier says, don't worry, they'll tell us and we'll tell you if and when we feel like it. Again, probably violating federal law, probably violating her own Sovereignty Act. She's also suggesting that she's going to nationalize oil and gas facilities by calling them critical infrastructure and stationing guards at the door who say who can and cannot go in. Is this a conservative government? Is this a government that believes in free enterprise? She also suggests that there is a market demand that somehow oil and gas companies are not fulfilling. And she will sell Alberta's oil and gas by giving up our royalties, by giving up our cash royalties, taking them in oil and gas instead, that she will somehow resell in a way that oil and gas companies are somehow unable to do. So somehow the provincial government has a better bead on oil and gas markets than do the people who work in this every single day. So basically what you saw today was a cooked up potion of things that won't work, that are likely illegal, and that will not in fact make any difference to Albertans' prosperity. So what we know now is that this government has spent $7 million of Alberta taxpayer money on a fruitless campaign to try and convince people, I guess, to vote for Pierre Poilievre in the next election. But they've spent this money. By the way, the energy minister in the House yesterday admitted that alleged that industry costs are not passed on to consumers in his conversation about the massive increases in salaries at the Alberta Energy Regulator. Yet, they've spent $7 million trying to convince people that industry costs get passed on to consumers. This is completely incoherent. This is a government that is looking for sound bites, looking for virtue signaling wherever they can, and not serious about a very serious threat to Albertans. Najwan, did you want to add anything before we take questions?
This is good.
All right, questions.
The thing is, they are talking about, you mentioned this.
Oh, there you are.
Focus.
I could hear you and I couldn't see you. There you are. Mm-hmm.
What focus on kind of to deal with the U.S. But do you think that Alberta has any point when it says the emissions cap is going to be a problem for production?
Look, let me be clear. I couldn't resist. No, this is actually true, that the emissions cap is not good policy. It's not good. The federal emissions cap is not good policy. It's not good policy for Alberta. But let's keep in mind that Alberta has an emissions cap on the oil sands. It was put in by Rachel Notley. It was not removed by the UCP. And industry will tell you that it's actually a very useful tool for them. It sharpens the mind. It helps them think about how to reduce emissions intensity and how to continue to grow production, knowing that that cap is out there. That kind of emissions cap works. The federal emissions cap, because the government didn't even try to provide them with any data, didn't try to negotiate with them, didn't try to talk to them about the emissions cap in Alberta that does work, is foolhardy. It's arbitrary, the timelines are arbitrary, the amounts are arbitrary. But once again, this is a premier who has never seen a carrot. All she has in her arsenal are pointy sticks. And we would never have gotten to this point if Alberta hadn't been such an unwilling partner to actually take on this issue. The Premier has constantly talked about we'll get to net zero by 2050 and constantly said no to every single initiative that might get us to net zero by 2050. She's deeply unserious about this. And because of that, and that's why you have an environment minister that can't seem to say reduce emissions. And because of that, you have other parties saying, well, if you're not going to be serious, we're going to do this on our own. And that is not how we move forward on this, because the oil companies have to get to that target, and the government is far behind the industry on this.
Now, the government, of course, today you mentioned the Minister Schultz said they're trying to shut down our oil industry. Of course, they did get the pipeline built, the expansion of the Trans Mountain. So do you think that Ottawa is out to somehow hobble the oil and gas industry in Alberta?
Look, I think that Minister Guilbeault, the Federal Minister of Environment, says a lot of things that are very damaging. But I also think that the federal government understands that if Alberta is not operating on all its economic cylinders, the Canadian economy suffers greatly. You never, ever balance the federal budget unless you have an Alberta economy operating on all its cylinders, which means you've got to have a healthy oil and gas sector. And, thanks to the work of Rachel Notley, with an able assist from the mayor of Calgary at the time, we got a pipeline built, which is covering up all sorts of fiscal sins of this provincial government by getting more money for WCS, Western Canada Select Oil. So it's clear that when you negotiate, when you go to the table, you can actually get stuff out of even this federal government. This premier has never tried that.
Hi, Jonathan Red, the Western.
Hi, Jonathan.
You spoke about the not wanting to use the Sovereignty Act to respond to the federal emissions cap. What would you do to respond to the emissions cap instead?
Well, had we been in government, this never would have happened, because we actually would have had a coherent provincial federal environment policy. So that's part of the problem, is that we've gotten here through the incompetence of this provincial government. Now that we are here, absolutely we need to take it to court. But to stand up here and perform and pretend the Sovereignty Act does not give us the chance to take it to court, when in fact we're doing the exact same treatment, legal treatment, is kind of disingenuous. It's misleading to Albertans.
You spoke about Premier Danielle Smith engaging in leaders when it comes to this Alberta's Harper Cap motion rather than trying to negotiate with the federal Canadian government some more. Why do you think she's doing that?
Well, because it's on her timeline. And she admitted that today. She said she was going to do this anyway. She knew she was going to do it, despite the fact that she's surprised by everything. But the point is that today of all days, today being a day where we need to show our negotiating strategy, and by the way, far be it from me to give the Premier advice, but you don't show your negotiating strategy by ceding the fact that the other party is correct before you even have your meetings with the federal government. So by her just admitting things that are not true, that there's a migration problem from Canada to the U.S., that fentanyl flows from Canada to the U.S., and that's a major problem in the drug crisis in the U.S., that puts you on the back foot on negotiations immediately, and she hasn't even had her first meeting with the premiers and the prime minister yet, and she could have done irreparable damage just by saying those things. Emma?
Emma, one of the points in the plan is to double pipeline capacity to the coast and also to the United States. Where do you stand on that? Do we need more pipelines?
Oh, well, I guess that means that we have to elect an NDP government, because as we all know, Conservative governments in the last generations in this province have built precisely 0 miles of pipeline to Tidewater. The only people who got pipelines built to Tidewater were Rachel Notley's NDP government. And so absolutely we need to do it. If she's thinking of buying Keystone XL yet again, then we're going to have a lot to say about that. But absolutely, if we can increase export capacity and there is a market demand for that, it's the New Democrats that know how to do that.
Anything? Yeah. Jason?
There are going to be a lot of people who are going to look at some of this stuff and think that this is the United Conservative government nationalizing the oil
Very much so.
sector explain your observations on that.
Yeah, well, they're not nationalizing it. They're not buying the oil companies, but they're telling the oil companies who they can have on their facilities. Presumably they will enforce that. They're telling the oil companies to whom they have to sell. They're telling the oil companies that they cannot report to their shareholders on the very good work they're doing to reduce emissions. This is not a free enterprise government. This is a government that wants to control business because they think they know better than the shareholders, the investors, and the smart people who go to work every day in the oil patch.
Anything else, anyone?
I guess just picking up on Jason's question, I'm wondering if you're an oil executive with major investments in Alberta right now, what goes through your mind when you about your future business choices when you hear what you have to say today?
The biggest challenge that this premier has had in the last 3 years is every time she talks about business, she betrays how little her government knows about business. And she creates business uncertainty and an uncertain investment climate. So we have seen over and over again in different industries, renewables, for example, we went from the #1 jurisdiction in North America for renewables investment to nothing. She chased away at least $34 billion in investment, never to return, probably 25,000 plus jobs, never to return. And so creating more and more business uncertainty, particularly in an environment where the president-elect of the United States is saying 25% tariff on oil and gas into the U.S., and you are an investor who has the choice of where to invest. Capital is global. You're going to invest that in the U.S. You're going to do fracking, you're going to do shale in the U.S. rather than in the Alberta oil sands. And the Premier did nothing today to make investors feel more comfortable. Indeed, she said, we're going to run your business for you because we know how to do it better than you do. And that is the #1 way to create even more business uncertainty. Anyone else? Okay, thanks very much, folks.